And go live. Okay, and we're live. All right, welcome everybody. Today is the chapter on Noah. I think there's a lot to say. I think, especially now that we're talking about something that Ibn Arabi is pointing towards with this two poles of transcendence and immanence. Um, the thing that is immediately stands out is his interpretation of the Noah story from the Quran. And also, I think we should take note of the was it the person that is introducing the chapter. He's saying that this is at best outrageous. It's an outrageous interpretation. It almost seems um, it is heretical to the common understanding. Um, and I think maybe I would like to kind of circle on this idea of Ibn Arabi's interpretation of imminence and transcendence, and kind of like what was everybody's impressions of this specific chapter on that those two poles. Um, does Ibn Arabi like convince us of this? Is this something that we should entertain when we kind of consider like the divine at all, and so on? So I think with that, I'll pass it on to Jyoti.
Yeah, hi. So I wanted to be more silent today and listen more and grasp more. So not the right person to begin the discussion with. I found the chapter difficult, and yes, I mean it's interesting to go through transcendence and immanence. What I also want to point our attention at, and where my question also comes from, he on page 72 there is this entire idea that in this Noah story he reinterprets the, and page 72 at the end, he reinterprets the wrongdoers, infidels and sinners of the last verses of Noah as saints and Gnostics, drowning and burning not in the torments of hell but rather in the flames and waters. He again goes on to say the same thing on page later on, where he's giving these kind of hierarchy, and he says that on page 79 it only increases the oppressors, meaning those who oppress themselves, who inherit the book. These are the first of the three, since he places the self oppressor before the moderate one and the doer of good works. My Lord, increase my perplexity concerning you. So I understand this in the context of when we are perplexed, when there is a confusion, when there is a bewilderment, and somebody like Rumi, wound is from where the light enters, and one can see that you are closest to God, as against somebody who is a doer of good works. Still, I would want everybody to comment on it and help me understand. I mean, what is this distinction over here? Because the entire discussion goes on to say he has so at the end of this paragraph on page 79 he says he has an imaginary starting point and what he supposes to be a goal, and what lies between them, which is like the doer, which is like the good doer. While for the God centered man, who is like a self oppressor, there is no restriction of beginning or end, possessing the most comprehensive existence and being the recipient of truth and realities. And by the self oppressive man, I was also looking at somebody who is constantly in self denial or something like a self hatred, something with which we all struggle in our lives also. Which then why I'm making a connection over here, because this chapter is also giving us a very interesting insight when he says that who truly knows himself, knows his Lord, we will show them our signs on the horizon. which then to means that how important it is to know oneself. Knowing the Lord actually means knowing oneself. And if knowing oneself means being in self denial, or being self tormenting, or being self oppressive, or being this kind of self deprecation that we constantly engage in, is there a parallel over there? And if there is a parallel, then does it mean that Lord speaks to us when we are in those so called zones? Yeah, Chetan.
I and I can't follow the pages because page numbers are a problem. But I'm interested in thinking about, as Javier said, this relationship between immanence and transcendence in some senses. If you think about it, uh, even modern philosophy somewhere in some sense struggles with these two positions, where transcendence, demand us to move forward something, and immanence would demand something like descent into something, making that something your own in some senses, to descend into it. It's not an ascent, it's going down in some senses into that thing. And how do we think through these two positions together? It's an extremely interesting insight that I think Ibn Arabi is giving us. That how do we, and I would also want to, I think, about from Javier or from Thomas, for the explanation of a Noah story, what importance are it hold in Quran, and how do we understand that story in this context? Because Noah was, for in some ways, for and Mother Rabi was transcending, but he could not descend in some sense. He could not follow the imminence. So how do you all look at it? Maybe we can have a discussion and we can come back there. Yeah, Thomas.
I know, as we said off the record before we started recording, Javi, I was curious about my interpretation of this based on my practice of the faith. I think again, I would agree. This is listen. There's a reason why traditional Muslims don't like Sufism. Like, there's a kind of a weird side. You get like a side eye when you talk about you're studying this stuff, because quite honestly, there's a kind of exuberance, to say the least. I think one of the more famous ones is the Sufi poet who goes, "I am the truth," and whoopsie daisy, gets himself killed over that. As one example. This would be one of those examples where the recounting of the burning in hell and the drowning of the flood is reinterpreted as knowledge. I'm going to try my best to try to give a kind account to this, to say, because I say this because there's in the Quran there's many mentions of you will know the truth at the last judgment. So basically, this is always this retelling of knowledge going to be acquired of these basically sinners, or the ones who are fallen, or the ones who will find out their error at the last judgment. I bring it up because gnosis, which is the exact language used in the translation here, is the one who knows by God. So my interpretation of it is basically these people are finding out the faces of. Remember, we talked many times before about the face of God being very different, right? There's a kind of wrathful side and a merciful side. So these sinners and people who are fallen and drowning and burning in gnosis is a kind of knowing. Because it is true that when we sense pain by drowning or burning, we are getting information. We're aware of our suffering, for example, just on basic life experience. So that's my interpretation and of what he's getting to that particular point. But also, to be fair to him, I think Ibn Arabi's larger point beyond is taking the Noah story and talking about, really is saying the idea that you could be drowned in this knowledge and yet the perplexity of hiddenness. So actually, the real purpose of the conversation is one of my favorite two names of God, of Allah, right? The hidden and the manifest, and they're always put together as demonstration, because it has to point out that in every moment there's a manifestation, there's also a hiddenness, and it's the hiddenness that governs the manifest. So I think it's more the purpose of bringing this up is that even these people who are coming awash in the knowledge of God, or is still in ignorance, ultimately, they actually are very much blinded. And even notice in Noah's proclamations about God, there is none unlike him. It's a affirmation with denial in the same statement. So there's a whole. I think that one line I thought really powerful was the whole truth is a conjunction. It's not a discrimination. So this is where we're getting at, is that it's not good enough. It's not pure negation, right? So this is the imminence transcendence discussion. It's actually one of the ultimate. It's the purpose of learning the names of Allah is to try to bridge that gap. It's the Islamic method to try to understand that gap. My understanding of Christianity and Christology is to say that Christ is the bridge. So the argument made is that we needed Christ to be reincarnated because we needed this bridge of the imminence and transcendence of God brought together. So that's the Christian argument. Muslims would say we don't need that. We can just use the names of Allah to get that bridge of understanding. I will say in general, for me personally, the takeaway for this text was something I've been meditating on for about a week or two, I would say at this point. Because I'm in another group, Nick Land reading group, part of the Indie Thinkers group. So Nick Land is this big accelerationist. His writing is like a method. It's literally this guy was on speed writing. You get that quality sometimes in his writing very clearly. But there's a constant mentioning of spirit, and I come from a Aristotelian background, and spirit is not really in Aristotelian thought. It's form instead. So what is the distinction between spirit and form? I think this text really reinforced my other private readings really well on discussing how we mean when the Sufis say the forms as the manifest, what they're meaning, because the spirit is the hidden, and there's a kind of proportionate relationship going on. So this has a lot of implications. So one, for example, that the argument that how can human souls and bodies come back to life in the Last Judgment is because our spirit is a property of God. It's not just it's not like an assemblage, right, that of just matter collapse together, slam together, that once we die just goes to dust. The point is that a soul is not good enough to justify that, because animals have souls, but are they coming back to the Last Judgment? The answer is we don't know. At least my understanding is no. Humans are. And the reason why humans are is because we have basically, and this is why we say we know God by knowing ourselves, our souls have a spirit, and that spirit is basically a linkage. It's like a link directly to God, and that's why knowing thyself is a mirror to God when understood the right way. So basically understanding the relationship of spirit to form articulates, I think, very clearly the spiritual doctrines of Islam, and I would say also Christianity too, at the minimum, from reading that. So I think this text was very useful for that articulation, and especially parallel to this understanding of the names manifest and hidden for Allah. And that's all for me.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Jyoti and Chitan. I guess I'll just try to go in order of approaching Jyoti's, what she brought up with the question of the self, I believe, where if to know oneself is to know thy Lord. I think if I understood correctly, Jyoti, you're trying to refer to like the self as we know it, right? Like if I'm like self-deprecating, what kind of form does my God take in that sense? Is that a question that you were asking? Okay. I would say from my understanding, and I don't think Ibn Arabi actually kind of goes into this, but I know it has to do with, actually he did go a little bit into it with the Adam portion. So what I'm going to do here is, the way that I understand this text of knowing thyself and knowing thy Lord is ultimately very paradoxical, meaning that it has to do with us being this mirror for the divine reality. But the thing is, because of our nature, all right, and I'm kind of adding a Christian element to this, but anyways, because there's this obscurity going on with the mirror, we have to purify that mirror so that way we can see ourselves as we are, and see, which ironically is to know yourself and know your Lord, right? So what I'm saying is that I think within that statement, it is the provocation to kind of go through this ego annihilation, right? Shed this false self that we have, and then emerge into this, true self, which the true self is the only self that is in the particular form of God or the divine, the particular manifested form. But again, we have to kind of do this purification process to even see that or know what that is. So that's how I look at it, GOT. I don't know if that's helpful to you, because I know a lot of spiritual writers like to divide this idea of like there's a false self and a true self, and it's only in the true self that you can see yourself in the divine form that is manifested. Now, to kind of go further on, what I really enjoyed about this talk between transcendence and immanence is Ibn Arabi is really taking seriously the oneness of being. He's really pushing this element about this oneness of being. And that's why in the introductory note, the author states that Ibn Arabi doesn't even claim that Noah or the quote, the evildoers or the sinners, that none of them are right or wrong. And I found this kind of fascinating because, the apparent meaning, when you're interested in becoming Muslim or you're learning about the Quran, is that, or just even if you're in Christianity, is that, well, these guys didn't want to believe that God was the only God, and so they rejected that notion. But the fact that Ibn Arabi is adding this element of, no, it's not that they rejected that notion, is that you basically said your message the wrong way. And that's how I understood it. I feel like he was saying to Noah that actually your message, the way you spread your message, was that you did it in a way that made them push you away further from listening to you, from being able to receive your message. And I think this is actually a very subtle point, a very subtle, paradoxical point to consider when we, as human beings, you could say that when we were trying to relay the truth to somebody, that in the manner in which we relay, it can actually push somebody further away. You actually make them dive deeper into their, you could say, at least for the story of Noah, into their more immanence, right? Their more immanent perspective of God. And so I found that a very subtle point to be made, this sort of paradox that isn't really acknowledged in just our common, and apparent in our society. Usually people just want to tell the truth and say it like that, but there is no, you could say, emotional intelligence in the telling of the truth. They don't understand that not everybody has the capacity to handle specific truths in that manner. So I do find it, again, really intriguing that Ibn Arabi decides to confront this dilemma of Noah and the others as something that Noah needed to do. He needed to show them that there was both transcendence and immanence, rather than just approaching it from almost like an extreme point of view, just God is solely transcendence. And I think it goes back to what Jyoti had brought up, where she was reading on page 79 about, if we solely talk about only transcendence or immanence, we are doing that imaginary starting point. We're drawing like this line, you know, by either restricting God or limiting God, by either way. And I think at the end of it, I think what Ibn Arabi really wants us to understand is that if you take the oneness of being seriously, then uh, I'm trying to explain this. If you take the oneness of being seriously, everything is that aspect and everything is fluid in that nature, but it's also about having the knowledge of that discrimination, about knowing which form is being manifested. But I talked enough, so I'll pass it to Jyoti.
Well, yeah, I think I will go back to what I was saying earlier and connect it to what Javier was saying. So, yeah, I mean, there is this authentic self, and I guess it's also to do with suffering. That in the moments of suffering, it's not just, I mean, in very colloquial way, we can say that we remember, like in my the place from where I come, we say that suffering becomes important because only then you realize there is God. But more than that, the fact that in suffering there is something that gets revealed to you, and what gets revealed to you becomes extremely important. And one can also then think of Nietzsche and philosophy that has talked about the importance of suffering over here. And then it makes sense to understand these self-oppressor, moderate one, and the doer of good works, the discrimination that he is bringing in the entire story of Noah. And something that Javier was just saying right now, that there was something wrong that Noah was doing. Although I mean I don't know like lot over there, but the way Noah summoned and the way Muhammad summoned, and there is a very interesting thing about the day and the light, which I found completely fascinating. That how he was summoning them in day and then how he was summoning them in night. But when it comes to Muhammad, by night he was suffering, but by night during the day and by day during the night, which is like I mean the way I understood it, that I mean again I will go back to the point of suffering, and how we also need to come to light, how from darkness to light, how when the truth gets revealed, how how one also walks towards that. And in the same way there is a purpose that night and the darkness and so-called private life also has, so-called suffering also has, so-called the low zones also do have, because it's only when by night that these aspects of ourself can really flourish. And so generally I mean we really don't pay attention to it, and I found that fascinating personally, because there is an importance that is given to that as well. However, what is happening in day is also given important. So the way immanence and the transcendence, I guess in this particular, in these portions, by night during the day and by day during the night, really gets taken up, because it's like how they are woven in each other. And I think that's what the text is affirming over here. Yeah, Chetan.
Thank you, Jyoti. I think there's a lot to unpack in this chapter in some senses, which we need to start thinking about, because there's a lot happening actually, which can be uh, which can only be felt in some senses, but not really. If you start the chapter, I don't know, I don't know the editions that we are dealing with, but in my sort of book, there's this line. Um, I'll just quote it to you, and then you can see if it is there in yours or not. It's extremely interesting line. Whoever holds his being as two things is a polytheist, and whoever holds that he is one unifies him. You know, how do, I think there's a lot happening in something like that, which we need to, be aware of lightening him if you hold duality, and of making him transcendent if you unify him. You are not he, but you are he, and you see him on the essence of things, both boundless and restricted. I think a lot of what is happening in the Noah story needs to be looked at through this lens, this lens where he's trying to think about duality not as something, dual, and how do we explain this kind of a problem in some senses? So duality becomes a problem when your being itself is split in some senses. But when you come to accept that split, something unifies in you. And how do we think through that unification? That unification is not something that negates the split. It's not something that leaves the split behind. In fact, it is something which emerges from a certain acceptance of the split itself, a way to hold the split together in some senses. So when you start thinking, and I'm just, I know I might be diluting Ibn Arabi over here. When you start thinking on that lens, and when you start thinking of Noah's story actually involves, in this sense, both these aspects, precisely because, as Jyoti was saying, that it involves on one side, um, people those who would follow Noah, and on the other side, people those who do not believe in Noah in some senses. And there is there's a form of I think relationship between transcendence and immanence emerging from that duality. And as far as I could read it, and I don't know how you all would read it, and I'm really interested to know, are you reading it in that manner, and how, at least because I've not read the Quran in the same manner as you. So I would like to know how do you chart that relationship of Noah to people those who followed him to the ark and so on and so forth, and people those who were opposing him in that sense, and what is that relationship for you, and how is that contradiction emerging for you, and how do we think through it? Maybe we can talk more about this relationship, immanence and transcendence more in that sense.
Yeah, I think the main thing I would pick up on is just on this idea of self-emptying, emptying. There's a concept in Christianity on kenosis that I'm reminded that basically when Christ self-emptied himself, he became nothing. It's actually a very interesting meditations and within Christian mysticism about it. But I'm reminded here of this idea of that's usually in the context, usually interpreted to mean basically moving our will to see God's will, the Spirit come through. But in the particular here, how Josie talked about how suffering reveals, right, the kind of emptying out, a kind of awakening can occur from understanding. That suffering can sometimes open up that the ego kind of blocks away otherwise. I think we talked about that in previous weeks together. I actually appreciate us talking together too, because also I think, remember, this is the wisdom of exaltedness. So remember, each one of these prophets has a name, like a kind of quality to pick up. And I think it is interesting to see that Noah's is exaltedness. And when we exalt something, it's a kind, I think, remember, in the particular sense in the Islamic understanding, it literally is a kind of transcendence. It's this kind of awness, this kind of grandness, right? Tremendousness of the quality. So it's very much, so I think that might be the thread here of what's being talked about, is that Noah is an archetypal study, but he's flawed because it's in contrast to, within this model, the more perfect model, which is Muhammad, right? Because the example is that Noah's knowledge was limited. He only was able to communicate in one mode and not capture the full story of the understanding. And that's the thrust of why we're hearing about this, because the argument is that Muhammad was most successful because he was able to articulate his understanding, in the moments of the day with inner understanding, and then in moments of the night with outer understanding. There's also stories of that. Like there's I think one of the examples was when he went really hard one time with his companions on how much sin there is and how much everyone's going to go to hell, and all his companions were crestfallen because they just were despondent and they're all going to hell. And Muhammad had to give them a word of encouragement. He had to give it a kind of benevolent encouragement to them to get their hopes up again, to kind of get enthusiastic again in the practice of Islam. This is just things I'm meditating on or just hearing out loud here. So I think just the big point here, I would say, what's the purpose? Not even, again, in the particular of this radical reinterpretation of those burning and drowning. It's a larger understanding of a kind of limit of knowledge, and that when we just see God as this exalted thing, without any imminence in any sense, not only the hidden, none of the manifest, we have not a full understanding of what God is. And that's what the story was being told here. That's my interpretation of how to understand this chapter. That's all for me.
So something kind of hit me a little bit when Thomas was talking and Chitan and Jyoti. I started thinking about there is a way to look at this chapter, because I think Chitan kind of nailed it in the head for me when he said that this duality. It's not in order for something to emerge, you don't need a pure negation, which is something that is really, really, really important to think through. Because I almost want to say, like, everybody talks about more of a pure negation rather than this thing that is, you could say, maybe an incomplete negation. Like, it's, I don't know what even to call that. But it actually made me think this story of Noah and the way Ibn Rabi presents it, right, is that if we combine the apparent meaning, right, the apparent meaning of the story of Noah is that the flood comes and all those guys perish, and Noah and the people that join in the ark is salvation, right? Now, if we combine what Ibn Rabi is saying, it reminds me of another text that I read in the Perennial Philosophy, where Huxley identifies what he calls survival and then complete, like complete. I can't even think of the word. Like the complete return. What's the word? Anyways, so there's this distinction between survival and then complete return, which is amazing to think about, because I think it's exactly what Chitan is talking about when he says that. Because even Huxley says that heaven and hell is not complete deliverance. That's what I meant. Complete deliverance. So heaven and hell for Ibn Rabi in the Perennial Philosophy is actually not a complete deliverance. It's actually a survival. It's only when you sort of go beyond those two that it's a complete deliverance, which is fascinating, because when you kind of like study the readings of like the saints and the mystics, is, in my opinion, most of them are not kind of caught up in the troubles of them wanting to go to heaven or hell. They have this just complete fascination and adornment for God himself, right? They're more entertained with that idea rather than entertaining, am I going to heaven or am I going to hell? So I think we can look at this reading in a sort of analogy of survival and complete deliverance, where Noah would be not wrong, but it's incomplete. It's only at best survival, which is kind of like why Noah, the people on the ark survive, but they're still on earth. There is no complete deliverance, so to speak. So I think it is useful to look at it in these terms, because then we could see that, and I'll add the ego in here, is that when the ego is occupied with either being afraid of going to hell and wanting to go to heaven, it is still essentially an ego thing. It's only when we sort of annihilate the ego that the ego no longer is confronted with heaven and hell being a problem. In fact, Huxley would say, and some other mystics have said, is that both ways are safe ways to get to complete deliverance. Now, I am kind of adding some perennial philosophy mix into this, but I think it's useful to read the text in this way, because I do really feel like Ibn Rabi is talking about, in some sense, this this thing that Chitan brought up, where it is this duality, and it is useful to, I guess, live in that duality, but at the same time, it would be a mistake to assume that there is nothing beyond that duality. And so I think that's where the point of discrimination comes in, where you need to understand that there is more to this duality, but at the same time, this duality is sort of part of it. But yeah, I'll just let you guys tell me what you guys thought about that.
Yeah, I think this was brilliant, Javier. I mean, I really like the portion of this hell and heaven, and how both of the ways, they are a way to complete deliverance. It's not generally the usual thing of heaven. Also that then tells us how we look at truth, and the fact that the mirror thing and knowing oneself is like knowing the Lord means knowing self, and how in the mirror one sees that. I just want to say one thing over here. This also reminds me, Chetan has started this Freud reading group, and only last night we were discussing in this reading group about Freud, and how earlier, I'm forgetting the name, but the hypnotic guy, and how for him it's like a unified self, and then the split self becomes a problem. But with the entrance of the Freud, he affirmed this split self itself. And also, he said a very interesting thing, Chetan, in the entire discussion, which is again related to what you are talking about, this ego's desire, and how we need to take responsibility of the desire. So, this ego's desire to go to heaven and not to hell, how there is a toxicity within this desire, and something that we all can experience as well. When there is a desire and that desire becomes too high, that desire also has the capacity to annihilate us, to completely devour us. It can hollow you out. The fact that one has to take responsibility of that desire, which is like to take care of it. I mean, I understood it theoretically, although personally I still needed to understand what does it mean to take responsibility of the desire. So a lot of homework that needs to be done over there. Yeah, Chetan.
Thank you, Jyoti. Yeah, his name was Janet, Pierre Janet, with whom Freud. Um, I actually, I actually want to probe some, for some reason I want to trouble everybody and probe what he's writing more in some senses, because somehow I'm still struggling with the text myself, and and some because what comes out in Noah's story is this extremely complex relationship in some senses, that Noah shares. On one end, there is a certain kind of a limitation that Noah shares with his own people, because he can't be, in some senses, immanent with them. He could not descend down with them. He could only transcend in some senses, and there his own limitations could not be. And that is how I'm reading it right now. I'm not sure whether that is the correct reading also or not, because it's all so muddled. But I would want to read it with you all, actually, so that we can find some ways of thinking through this kind of a challenge. You know, um, so if we read him from, I think, the point where I quoted him, and I'm just going below that. I'm not sure my additions are the correct one or not. Uh, he says, God said, there is nothing like him. Quran 42:11, thus make himself transcendent. And he is all hearing, all seeing, thus likening himself to creation. When he says, there is nothing like his likeness, uh, committee, he likens himself to creation and makes himself two. And when he says the all hearing, the all seeing, he makes himself transcendent and united. If Noah had combined the two calls to his people, they would have answered him. And this is important. However, he first called to the external doctrine of transcendence, then to the internal doctrine of immanence, and then said to them, ask forgiveness of your Lord, for he is always forgiving. And he said, I have called my people night and day, but the more I call them, the further they run away. He said that his people did not want to hear his call, for they knew that they should respond to it. So you can see some kind of tension emerging in that sense of people who respond to Noah, people who do not. How do we think through it? Those who know God apprehend that Noah pointed out regarding his people. This was praise in the form of blame. They, those who know God, understand that the people did not respond to his call only, because his call separated between transcendent and immanent aspects of reality. And there's a word in the bracket called Furqan, which you might be more familiar with. There's a note below it. Um, I'll just come to that note. Yeah, note number 14th. Furqan does not appear as a phenomenon of Al Quran, the meaning of redemption, but rather the infinite of Farqa. He divided, separated. Okay. Furqan again refers to division and separation in substance. Two that we've been discussing about. Between transcend immanent aspects of reality, where one should combine the two aspects and not separate them. Whoever holds a combination of two aspects does not pay attention to separation, even if it is in a state of separation, because the combination includes separation and not vice versa. And and for this reason, only Muhammad and this community, which is the best community singled out for people, were distinguished by the Quran, and we can go on from there. And something about this issue of one versus two, in some senses, that the combination doesn't exclude the separation. Combination includes the separation in some senses. And and, and if I may add something like Lacan would say, and this is important because it will maybe help us think through this problem that Arabi is asking us to go through in some senses, which is that if you look at modern Lacanian thinking, and his thinking is of negation is not zero. He is not saying that there is zero, thus there is two. No, what he's saying is that there is a minus one. If you think about it, what he's saying is there's a minus one. That one that should be there is the one that is missing. And now, if you come into Arabi's world, where Arabi's minus one would not be, say, Lacan's minus one in that very simplistic sense, but if you start thinking about this problem of one in Arabi, a one that actually includes, and Thomas was also hinting us in that direction, a one that actually includes different forms. It doesn't exclude the forms. And what is the relationship with form and content that would come when you start thinking that one to the minus one in some senses, a one that that always, as we were discussing, me and Javi were discussing last time, a one that always mirrors the reality in some senses, a one that only reflected back to you in different forms of your own self. You can only see yourself in the real, as he said in the second chapter. And somewhere I think in this transition from Noah to Muhammad, prophet in some senses, there is that transition of this affirmation of separation to the combination of separation, and how do we think through that affirmation of transcendence and immanence that comes with prophet and from Noah to prophet in some senses. And I think that's somewhere that my head is at this point, and I would like to ask you to all to think more with me on this and see.
Yeah, I mean, to build on what the points have been said before, this kind of reflectiveness for circularity. Shaitan, you talk about the negative one multiple times. I mean, I've been just out of curiosity, I've been looking into the imaginary numbers, right, and the roots of the imaginary numbers. So the whole pretense is that, imaginary number, the whole point is that basically it has a spiral circular effect onto itself. And it's a separate domain from the natural numbers, right? So this creates secondary properties to an entire existence of numbers. I think the most important thing is it has actually very deep relationships to E and pi as well. They have relationships with each other. You actually get -1 if you do, what is it? I think it's e to pi times I, like by the power of pi times I, you get -1 actually. So that's just a fun side note, just at that point. Now, building on that -1 idea, this idea that not just pure negation, lack. I mean, Javier, I'm surprised we even talked about this. This is basically the entire thread of that text we did with OG Rose. Right, there's this kind that lacks are not nothing. They have a kind of existence that does exist. Sorry to repeat the word, but so the point is that Noah is lacking what Muhammad fulfills. There's a kind that, and that's the demonstration of this. And by the way, like I think rereading, I'm rereading the text as we're talking. I'm feeling more doubling down on that interpretation because there's an entire section about the heirs of Noah, the heirs of Muhammad, and what their understandings are. And one does not have it, and one does have it. There's entire sections about it. I'm not going to go crazy about it, reading it out loud. But I'll just say the closing section, it's on the version I got hold of, page 77. It's like second to last paragraph. I'm trying to think of a good point to start. So basically this idea that by this, he confirms that in their case, the power was theirs, God being trustee for them. While in the case of the heirs of Muhammad, they are God's regents in his kingdom, God being both possessor and trustee, while they are possessors only in the sense that they are regents. So we have to break down what that means. To be honest with you, I don't know what that means exactly, but the point is there is a clear distinction going on in that section about the kind of exemplar that Noah is and the heirs of those understanding versus those who are following the exemplar of Muhammad. And this idea of wait for it, just open the language again, basically regency, possession, and trustee. That seems to be the terms being referenced here. I'm not sure. I don't have an understanding yet of those meanings per se, but I do think that might be something kind of fleshing out this idea that the whole purpose of this text is to talk about a difference of understanding. And what is that difference between Noah and Muhammad? And that point is Noah is, well, certainly good and a good exemplar. He's lacking still because he has too much in one mode of understanding and not enough in another. Or better, even better said, it's not even duality point of view, it's really more of a unity of the duality. Because basically any duality has a third underlying subject that it has to encompass both. So really the better understand is not even on the dualness, it's on the holding of the duality under one underlining understanding, which is from this text, it goes over again. The idea is like, there's another section, by the way, that even the Muhammad heirs don't have a grasp of the essence of God, the ipsity of God, but the forms, the manifestations. So I'll close with that for this round.
Yeah, that was good. That was Thomas. I keep forgetting that actually that yes, Muhammad is going to be the fulfillment of this, and I think this is. I don't know why this important detail left my mind is that Muhammad at the end of the day is the fulfillment of all that has passed, has all been shared up to him being the last prophet. So there is this. You could say. Well, we could just use the spiral example, right? Muhammad is the completion of that spiral. It is the full circling back of that spiral, which it would make sense that why he is able to sort of hold and share the message of God in a both transcendent and imminent way. And that's just kind of like a little side note from what Thomas was sharing. But I did want to sort of add this little piece, and it's towards at the end of 79. And it begins with, because of their transgressions, going beyond themselves so that they drown in the seas of the knowledge of God, which is what is meant by perplexity, and they were cast into the fire, which means the same as drowning according to their heirs. When the seas swell, or the same verbal root is used to denote the heating of an oven. Nor will they find any helpers apart from God, since their helpers are in essence nothing other than God, and they are annihilated in him forever. I'm curious if I should read this part. I'll read this other part too. Were he to deliver them from the seas of gnosis onto the shore of nature, he would be lowering them from an eminent stage of spiritual attainment that is relatively eminent, although in truth all is God's, through God indeed is God. This idea of transgression, and I think it's a very subtle point, and it is the maxim of the know yourself to know your Lord, which would be an interesting balance to use with this transgression, about how if their transgression is them going beyond themselves, and they got caught in this perplexity, I'm wondering if, the reason why Chitan's like problem is so maybe even like hard to think through, is that if we take our predispositions seriously, and that we as human beings are all ranked in certain degrees, and that there are potentials, like, for example, I may be ranked in a certain degree of blessedness, but I don't know the maximum of my, or the full potential of my highest degree according to my predisposition. Like, I don't know what that is because I don't fully know myself and my Lord. So in some sense, I don't know in that sense. But I think it'd be interesting to consider this transgression as, going beyond myself, is that I don't even know what going beyond myself would imply if I don't even know myself. So you can see, like, I'm already trapped in like some perplex argument here, or problem, because if the divine reality is, so perplexing in some ways, where is the line that I can divide to where I am not transgressing, and not going above my own kind of understanding. And I think this kind of goes back again to what me and Chetan has like repeated over some of these sessions, is like, how does one read something? How does somebody, how do we have this sort of just taking in without claiming to know? Because I think this is going back to some of the similar problem of possibly transgressing rather than self-surrendering. And I think this text is asking, in some ways, a self-surrendering. I don't know. I think there is room to suffice that when one is stuck between two poles, either the transcendence or the immanence, if one would simply sort of self-surrender, I think that is the right perplexity that Ibn Arabi is asking us to have, rather than sticking on one side of the pole and being perplexed in that manner. And I think being stuck on one side of the pole is what allows somebody to transgress themselves, essentially. They're not giving up. They're claiming to know something that they don't know. And Jitan, if you could just re-say your question, because I know I kind of forgot part of it. So, but yeah, if you could say that for me.
Yeah, no, you've always thought through that with me. I was just trying to struggle with this problem of how do we place Noah in relationship to the prophet, when we start thinking of this journey from, say, transcendence on the side of Noah to I think this affirmation of transcendence, immanence in the prophet. How do we think through that journey, and where do we place Noah within the long line of prophets, and how do we understand Noah's position over there, and how are you thinking about that? That's what.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's not enough context. Even, and I've read the Quran and Noah and Muhammad and all that. The only thing that I can even think about why Muhammad would hold the transcendence and the imminence is that within the Quran itself, it tells about the night that he ascended into the heavens. And this I feel like is what places Muhammad in the Quran, at least, as somebody that knows and has, because I think Muhammad, correct me if I'm wrong, Thomas, but I believe Muhammad in the Quran is the only one that has ascended to like the highest heaven, I believe, of something of that nature. He was the only one that ascended that high in comparison to the other prophets. But in terms of the question that you're asking, Chitan, I have no idea. I have no idea how, I mean, other than that basic understanding, other than, because Islam just has this linear progression that there's Noah and then it ends with Muhammad. It could just be that because Noah is one of the first, and Islam has this linear, linear progressive understanding about the Abrahamic religions where, Judaism was meant for a specific time and specific region of people. And then more prophets came, and then there's Christianity, and that was meant for a specific people and a specific time. And then lastly, it ends with Islam and Muhammad being the sort of tie, the seal to that whole thing. Other than that, I can't even possibly place what you're asking, but yeah, I'll pass it to Jyoti.
Okay, so I really didn't think of all this while reading the chapter. So this is exciting. Now, I think what Thomas said, that when this movement from Noah to Muhammad, and one can see that the nature of understanding which is changing over here. And I was just wondering what, Chetan, you were asking about this question. The immanence and the transcendence is a very interesting word also that you use, descent. And one can see that with Noah, there is this, the struggle is on. And the struggle that is on with Noah, one can see the struggle that is also on with the people, with subjects, with all of us. So it's not just that the immanence and the transcendence is something which is about in the Lord, in the God, but also in something in all of us. Where with Noah, one can see that there is a struggle in descent also. There is a problem that is having in descending over there. And that is why I think in this entire story, and when Javier was speaking, I was thinking, I can be completely wrong also. Again, it's in italics over here because of their transgressions. And one wonders that if this story, and so that's why it's in italics, because maybe then transgression in itself becomes important. And that is exactly why something with which I started with and I was struggling with, why somebody who is in self denial is placed higher than somebody who is a doer of good works. Because then, if because of the transgression they are supposed to be drowned, they are supposed to be damned, but maybe they aren't really damned. Maybe it's not the damnation. On the contrary, be it heaven or hell, what were you just saying? Complete deliverance. The path to truth. The path to truth doesn't really, I can be wrong, but the path to truth maybe doesn't matter whether you were able to catch up with Noah's ship, or you were drowning, because where you are drowning is also the sea of knowledge. And I felt that through Ibn al-Arabi, it's the Noah story which he's trying to rewrite, reinterpret in the language of Muhammad. That how maybe we relook at transgressors and who are drowning. And yeah, just some thoughts.
Yeah, like I said, I think the virtue of this reading group is sometimes you have interpretations that you don't realize until you start having conversations together. For me, the beginning of this was picking up the spirit form distinction, but now talking with everybody and actually reading as everyone's talking to catch up, I'm definitely getting a clear understanding of what this chapter is trying to talk about. So I remember my last cycle, I was talking about this trustee regent distinction. I looked quick earlier in the chat paragraph to understand what was going on there. That's what's going on is they're describing the difference between ordinary thought and contemplation. So it's saying that these are different modes of understanding. That's the way they're articulating it. And then further on, actually right by where Jyoti's referencing, in particular with this perplexity, it said there's a quote. This is a Quranic quote saying, well, I'll start with the text and then the quote afterwards. It says, in confusion, that is, in a spiritually self-edifying perplexity on the part of the heirs of Muhammad, who said, "My Lord, increase my perplexity concerning you." Now, that's the text from Arabi. Now, the quote from the Quran, when the self-revelation of the one shines for them, they proceed. But when it shines not, because of the multiplicity of forms, they stop in perplexity. He who experiences this perplexity is ceaselessly centered on the pole, God, while he who follows the, quote, long path to a distant God is always turning aside from the supreme goal to reach after that which is internally within him, running after imagination as his goal. So I think that's kind of what's getting hinted at here is this kind of hiddenness, this kind of again the Sufist mode of thought operation that's not ordinary thought. So the distinction again of articulating what's the difference between Muhammad and Noah is that Noah was using a mode of discourse that was ordinary language, while Muhammad incorporates contemplative language. In particular, and by the way, Javier, with your question about where is Muhammad in heaven, generally, yes, he is considered the highest. We don't know if there's other people. This really is more of a kind of a hadith kind of thing, opinions or judgments on that. So that's kind of a secondary thing. But we do know is the article of faith is, remember, it wasn't Muhammad was not literate. He was not a scholar. He was just a tradesman who basically from a divine revelation basically got this presented to him. So this idea that really in one way Muhammad was actually very ignorant, had this perplexity kind of approach to it. It's actually quite reasonable. It is the way he gained his knowledge from the Quranic verses. We have to remember that. So maybe that's also another way to talk about this, that a way of understanding, again, the distinction of Muhammad and Noah and what was kind of getting at with this text. Maybe that can help a little bit more.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Actually, there's a very interesting sort of line 72, which I think was something I was thinking about when I was raising this. In this context, Ibn Arabi, and I'm speaking of I think the same book now that you all are speaking from. So we got on the common page finally. I was reading another edition of it. Yeah, the Arabi does not regard the people of Noah as necessarily misguided, but rather as exponents, albeit unconscious ones, of the reality of the divine. Self-manifestation in the ever-changing multiplicity of cosmic forms, implying that had Noah tempered his extreme transcendentalism with little concession to divine immanence, his people might have been more responsive to exhortations. It is toward the end of the chapter that Ibn Arabi's interpretation of Quranic verses are similarly most outrageous, since he seems indeed to be suggesting being diametrically opposed to those who usually accepted. In short, he interprets the wrongdoers, infidel and sinners of the last verses of the surah, Noah, as saints and agnostics, drowning and burning not in torments of hell, but rather in the flames and waters of gnosis, bewildered in the divine simplicity of their awareness of the paradise of God. I think there's something to be thought through in this relationship of that Ibn Arabi is trying to draw between Noah and Prophet for us, and that relationship is not necessarily antagonistic. In some senses, one assimilates the other. It's the same kind of a question that emerges. where what he's trying to show is that a movement from know-how to profit is a movement in some senses of this assimilation reaching in its perfection and profit in some sense, in that sense. But it's the same ebbs and flows of that thinking which we have to think through within that movement the sinners also becomes the gnostics and so on and so forth. That is one part I think of the story. The other I think is that how do we think through this issue of, and I think that is where we're getting down to all our different questions, and even spirit informed questions are coming down to this problem of combination. That how do we think through combination and duality together in some senses? And I think one thing that emerges over there, which is this problem that it is much more easier to understand form when you separate it from other forms. you know when you already are bringing to it a premeditated form of background or reason under which that form has to be interpreted, so that it can exclude other things around it. The challenge of spirituality in some senses is that how do you stand completely open to the form, such that you are not bringing immediate exclusion to it, such that it can sort of cut in your own predispositions. You know, in some senses, it is in that sense. If you think through it in philosophy, it's the problem of paradigmatics. That to how do you think through a completely contingent paradigmatic relationship? You know, that it's not necessary and this is something any spirituality. If you look at koans, if you look at Sufi poems, Sufi stories, they are meant to teach you so that you are completely becoming open to contingent forms that comes to you through, and that is where you can combine things, where you're not simply saying that what is excluded is antagonistic to what is included. Instead, you are finding the truth of that form exactly in the combination of the relationship between what is excluded and what is included. What is excluded is in some senses part and combination of what is included, and how do you start thinking in that manner spiritually? And that I think that's something which opens up to actually it is opening up to me when I was reading these pages in some sense. I don't know how everybody else is thinking about it in some sense.
Can I jump in for a clarification? Yeah, so Jitin, but I mean, I understand some of it, but you are also saying how different forms are to be distinguished. That becomes important. How one form needs to be different from the other. But when you're talking of exclusion and inclusion, then like the day and the night kind of thing, you're trying to say that what is excluded is also becoming important in what is getting included. So basically, even when we are trying to make distinction between different forms, something which we were discussing in with the earlier book also, the distinction doesn't mean that that form is out. On the contrary, one also reconciles the other form. Am I going right?
Definitely, there is a way of thinking of both of them, in a manner that one doesn't necessarily become antagonistic to the other. There is a way of movement forward from this inside outside inclusion exclusion, such that it doesn't these relationships are not necessarily always become antagonistic in some senses. you know so even if you want to go back to think about the good and evil discussion, that discussion also becomes that the evil always have to become antagonistic to the good for the good to become good, and that's not necessarily so. And I think that's coming out in this in this chapter in some way. And I think Thomas's question of form and spirit actually would need to be thought at on these grounds in some senses, and we may see.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that's basically I had in my notes the exact point. Um, and in particular, too, actually, this text actually further along, remember the whole idea that the forms, right, which are different modes or representations. There's a line I quoted before where this is actually there's a kind of blindness that occurs when you get obscene, basically obscured. I remember that. Oh yeah, I remember that from the Shittik. I think the last text we read, the last book. This idea that the form is actually obscure, because they're only presenting to you one dimension or one side, not the whole part, which is what spirit would signify. Signifies what governs that, or what covers that. There's also another in the Noah text. There's actually a section again towards the back. The ignorant man imagines the object to be invested with divinity, and were it not for such a notion, neither the stone nor anything similar would be an object of worship. For this reason, he says, bid them name them. That had they done so, they would have called them stones, trees, or stars. Had they been asked whom they worship, they would have said a god, not God or the God. So I think was pointing to, and by the way, and I bring that up again to show maybe that's a limitation of thought right there was going on. Again, the idea that, also remember, I actually know in the thing about forms, remember that when we apprehend about forms, we're creating a schema in our mind, in our imagination. I think that language of imagination is actually very important because it kind of shows the illusory error that is at stake here when we're interfacing with the forms, because we don't directly access them. There's basically a schema, a phantasm that is under our mind that our intellect works on to apprehend. And that line before I said, where when we apply the divinity to material things, they're pointing out that they acknowledge their limitation of their thought by saying these are a God, not the God, or God in general, like as that all-encompassing oneness. So kind of just building on the points that Chetan just brought up. I think I get those ideas being said.
I think what's useful, at least for me, in thinking through what Chetan is saying and what Jochen and Jyoti, is like, I like to think of like the way the phenomenology of spirit in Hegel kind of functions through, is that you're always sort of confronting, a contradiction, so to speak. And that only when you sort of work through that contradiction does it become reconciled, and then you proceed to the next stage. It doesn't have to be Hegel, but even St. John of the Cross, Sufi writers, they all talk about these sort of stages of spiritual climbing, that you're always sort of confronting what would be a sort of contradiction. But I think what's really useful to think about what Chetan is saying and what all of you have been kind of reiterating is that what is perplexing, in my opinion, is that man himself thinks that he can actively do the reconciliation through thought. But it's actually not that way. It's actually the inverse. It's that man himself is the reconciliation. And this is why the maxim is, to know yourself is to know your Lord. That the only way that you can link between the unity and the multiplicity is not that you are actively doing something or like trying to think like some discursive thinking problem, is that actually you are sort of doing this mode of witnessing self-surrender where you allow to become the reconciliation of what you are perplexed by. And I feel like this is what is completely phenomenal of Ibn Arabi, that actually, and I think I think Muhammad is the best example, is that the one thing that we didn't bring up, Thomas, is one of the famous surahs is when Muhammad gets literally perplexed, and he is commanded to speak, to listen, and say something, right? So I find it fascinating that even though Muhammad, right, was illiterate and so on, he becomes the reconciliation of something of a contradiction that he was not. All of a sudden, he does have knowledge, and he is, spurring out this message of revelation and so on. He becomes the reconciliation, the end, the seal of all the prophets as such. But I think there is much to think about in this idea of what does it mean to, instead of trying to think through the reconciliation, which I I think that's what is like always what philosophy is trying to do, rather than be the reconciliation, which is, I don't even know where to begin with, because that is all entirely spiritual practice, to be the reconciliation rather than doing the reconciliation. I and there you can be in the space of perplexity openly and witness it. But yeah, I will, those were my thoughts.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of what we were discussing in the earlier book, or maybe in the first chapter. This is this about to be the reconciliation, the connecting point that comes between the being and the epistemology, ontology and epistemology. How most of the times we have this division where the being and knowing the world, but when knowing the world is in relationship with the world, then how the being that emerges out of it. So to be the reconciliation, is exactly asking for those knowledges, so that that ontology can come, which is about to be over there, rather than to just to think through. So instead of having this distinction, um, to be the reconciliation is to be able to think the reconciliation, or maybe the other way around. Yeah, that's it right now. Chetan.
I think coming down to this question of unity multiplicity, I've always found relationship to be almost, in some senses, a very interesting one. It's almost like if you attach, a single air balloon on both the sides. So if you press one, the other one will bloat up. If you press the other, this one will bloat up. It's something of that kind of relationship that comes in, where if you put all your pressure upon multiplicity, it's almost as if the unity gets sucked out. And if you allow multiplicity to be, the unity can expand itself. A certain kind of unity can emerge, and it's never a unity of the kind where you can unify the multiplicity in a single definition. I think even Arabi says somewhere over here, the truth on page number, I think, yeah, 73. The truth is that reality is manifest in every created being and in every concept, while he is at the same time hidden from all understanding, except for one who holds that the cosmos is his form and his identity. That he is the reconciliation. This is the name, the manifest, while he is also unmanifested spirit, the unmanifest. In this sense, he is in relation to the manifested forms of the cosmos, the spirit that determine those forms. So he's very clearly, and he says in few lines below, thus a true definition of the reality is impossible. So such a definition would depend on the ability to fully define every form in the cosmos, which is impossible. So one needs to start thinking about that. What is this form of unity that can actually only, in some senses, manifest, rather than emerge as a form of, you know understanding, logic, reason, or whatever you want to, call it on that part. Something that immediately always escapes the low cost in some senses. It always escapes the representation. And yet it can emerge and manifest through its own functioning, its own relationship with multiplicity in some sense. And that becomes one part of one thinking about this relationship, unity and multiplicity. That unity is not in some senses opposition to multiplicity, and in the same relationship can be held over there. That this antagonism itself actually completely sucks out any kind of meaning of the unity itself. It's only when you can think of them both together that unity finds some kind of meaning, and its meaning essentially is a form of a being which can actually inhabit multiplicity, which can actually reconcile multiplicity within itself. And how do we think through that kind of a question?
Uh, I just want to jump in, Thomas. Yeah. So, Chetan, I mean, it's all interesting and fascinating, but this is like more of a personal question that I generally struggle with. it's difficult to experience this. I mean, like something which Javier was also saying. It's one thing to say, to intellectualize, to cognitize, that to be reconciliatory. But I feel that in our world, those knowledges, those practices, I think when Ibn al-Arabi was writing, when all of this was happening, there were groups, there were communities, I'm sure there were practices. We have meditation, yoga, okay, fine. But I still don't find that enough to really be able to struggle with the fact of, sorry, this unified self which can reconcile, which has the multiplicity. Because I mean, the fact that there is this multiplicity, and how do we struggle with this question? Even if there is no unified self, I mean, we should not really affirm the unified self going by Freud, and the split subject is somebody. Still, in the everyday banal lives which is being lived on, it's very difficult to hold on with that idea, to hold on with this idea of unity and multiplicity. I don't know, how do you look at it?
See, I think Vinara says it somewhere, Jyoti, that one doesn't need to be necessarily in opposition to the many. And somewhere, say, if in Freud, Hegel, you may find that tends to be taking place. That's one thing. The other thing is, it's not that difficult to actually understand, because what we are discussing essentially between this antagonism between one and many is a question of limits. If you think about it, it's a question of limits in the sense that how do we come to terms with what our limits are. And there's a discussion to that end somewhere in the text. Actually, I wanted to come to that, maybe in the next round. But it's a discussion of not thinking in terms of, okay, I want to unify myself. Again, that would simply completely deflate you. That would tire you down. It is a question of coming to terms with your own limits in something that is easier to do. If you think about it, it's a question of saying honestly what I can and cannot do at that moment. And when it that limit uh, minute that limit becomes contingent and aware for yourself, I think something opens up for you. And how do you think to those limits becomes a more interesting kind of a problem. It's not a question of thinking how do you unify your being. That's never going to happen. Your being is split. There is duality at the heart of being itself.
My
Being will never get
perplexity is
unified.
coming from the fact that, is it just the act of thinking? Are these the questions that can only just be thought through? What I find in today's world are some of the practices which are lacking, through which these questions can be not just thought through, but can be practiced, can become part of the lives that we are living. I find I don't find those tools around. That's where my question is
No,
coming from.
okay. See, that's a different problem, and I don't want to take too much time because Thomas and Javier would be like, yeah. But see, that question becomes what role thinking can play in development of the being itself. That's the role you want to articulate then, and then the question needs to be answered. That of course, thinking alone can't do it. We all can, I think, accept it. Stoicism is a problem, and so on and so forth. I think the flip side is that if you can't think it, can you then do it? That's the question I would ask you. Of course, you need other practices alongside it, and so on and so forth. But to say the simple question, oh, I can simply do it and not think it, would that work in some way? And how would that work? And what do you?
Well, hold on. To jump in, I mean, I do think Josie's making a reasonable argument in the sense of actually applying this. Like, oh, this Sufi mysticism is fantastic. How do we apply this in any way to our real lives? Especially if the goal of this kind of study is to have a more, at the minimum, a kind of more positive effect of how we live our lives. We're not just a scattered mess of desire and just running amok. That'd be the minimal requirement. Maybe if you want, for those who actually have a spiritual belief system and affirm to it. The real question is, how do we actually get this kind of peace, right, of heart, and kind of resting in the heart of God kind of question? I think it is a legitimate question. I think all this discussion of all these texts are fantastic, but if we don't apply it, who cares at the end of the day? because also even in the study of philosophy, like eventually we get to ethics. We have to get there, how to live a good lives. I think on two parts. Part one, that to challenge Shaitan on his argument, can you do something without thinking it? I would make the argument of uh, what's the word? It's bricolage. Basically, it's a kind of experimenting where you don't already pre-know the outcome. You're just testing stuff out. And the rationality is in the one whom selects. You're not selecting in a pre-knowledge way. You're selecting in what's the best outcome for as revealed after the fact, posterior, not prior to the fact. So that'd be an example where we humans can act in ways that are not pre-thought all the way. And generally innovations in entrepreneurship, and usually in things in the science, in the kind of the crafts, usually go down that route. They're not successful when they already have a plan in their mind. It's more just in the doing, something shows up, and their rationality kicks in their selection of what's working, what's not. I think this question again of like, how do we kind of find the reconciliation? I think this is the whole practice of the spiritual faith of religion in one sense. Obviously, it's the ones doing our duty to God, paying our debt to God. But the other side is how to live a good life. What's a meaningful life? Because beyond even when we accept that, we're full of contradictions, but really we need stories to tell ourselves. We need a narrative of identifying what is a good life, and generally it's our actions. And now I will comment, there is an interesting point in this text where the self-oppressor is put forward higher than the do-gooder, the one who does good deeds. Would not be the one that usually the answer to this. How do you have a life that's fulfilled? And answers this question: do good deeds, do serve others, serve the community, things like that. Do virtuous actions. This text is saying something a little bit more. It's saying that, yeah, that's great, but we got to do more. We have to self-empty ourselves. So probably what that's getting at is, yeah, you can do these good things, but if you're doing it for yourself, it's like you did it for nothing. You have to go deeper. The reasons for your motivation for the act has to be a kind of self-emptying, a kind of doing it for the will of God, not your will, kind of question. That at least how this text would answer that question. And the answer why are cultures and societies and social structures don't have any of this, because we don't have any of that. It's quite the opposite. It's just rushing after desires, self-affirmation of desire. That's what it's all about, which is inherently naturally destroying because it makes it sophistic. Emotions and desires go all over the place. There's absolutely nothing steady with that. It's just ranging contradictions all over the place. So it's antithetical to everything talked about. But just on this text, what it seems to be pushing through is man is the actual one line I always talk about. Remember, man is given a special privilege because we're the one spiritual entity. There's angels, there's God, there's spiritual entities, but they don't have bodies. We do. We are that. That's where that contradiction comes in, by the way. That's inherently where it comes from, is that we're spiritual beings with bodies. Now, as opposed to agnostics, Muslims, and all the other Abrahamic religions don't say bodies are bad. We're not here trying to get out of our bodies. We're here to do a job. And that job is the unification of the universe, right? Both matter and form and spirit all put together. That's what man is. So the short answer is basically live a good life, but do it for the right motivations. That would be my short answer. How that plays out is each particular case. Listen, virtue comes out, goodness comes out of each moment of tragedy, hardship, and disaster that shows up in everyone's life. It's unique and individual to one. So the answer is there is no universal answer to that. There's only your answer, your response to the individual moments, opportunities presented to you. Kind of the kairos, not the chronos kind of time, the opportunity to make goodness reveal itself. That'd be the short answer. Is that satisfactory? I don't know. That's the best I got for you right now.
Well, to go in here, I am sympathetic to what Jyoti is saying, because that has been my absolute fascination for like the past couple of months, where I am more fascinated with practice rather than knowledge per se. But I will add this, in sort of sympathy to both of you, Chitan and Jyoti, is that I always like resorting back to the Hindu paths, with the devotional path, the path of deeds, and then the path of knowledge. Now, what's interesting about when I was reading The Perennial Philosophy by Huxley is that he said that even though the paths of deeds and the paths of devotion is not, you could say, a direct active thinking of knowledge, is that ultimately all three paths are a path of knowledge. And I thought this was a very interesting endpoint, that even though someone, and depending on their predisposition, is more inclined towards, charity openly and doing deeds, or maybe they feel more called to like a more devotional path, is that those two paths, in the end, if I guess practiced to its completion, is that in the end there are always a path to knowledge, that they learn something, that they end up knowing something at the end of this. So basically what I'm saying is that there is still this thinking and practice going on. I guess the real debate is, do we do it before, do we do it after, and so on. But I can clearly tell some of the paths that we follow upon because by the book's description, the path of knowledge are the philosophers and the religious devotees. So I always find it funny when we have questions like these, but clearly those are extreme poles, the three of them. So that would mean that all of us would probably fall in between probably two areas. I know for myself, I'm probably like path of knowledge, path of devotion, like I'm somewhere in between, because I'm often very concerned about the practice. Like I want to practice something, I want to do something. But that was a side note to add. But this question of thinking through the multiplicity and the unity, Chitan, I thought it was brilliant, because I think actually that's where we get stuck on. We oppose them to each other, the unity and the multiplicity. And what Ibn Arabi is trying to show us is that they are not opposed. They are, to kind of borrow a famous term to describe God, they are within and without. And I like this idea of conjunction. And the only way that I have been able to sort of understand this conjunction is by studying the Trinity, the Christian Trinity, because this is actually a very confusing theology for most people, because what they can't understand is that how are there three and then there's one? And the way Christianity approaches it is that the three are not negations, the three are distinctions of this one essence. And the way Islam would approach it is that there's this multiplicity of names under this one essence. So I do find it a little, kind of fascinating that in our, sort of theology between Christians and Muslims, that there is this answer about a conjunction already, that there is not ever really a pure negation as such. The only negation that there really is only distinction. But I want to sort of kind of roll back before we just accept distinction. It has to do with some of the readings that I've done on my own, but it's very important to sort of acknowledge this, that in my study of the perennial philosophy, one of the biggest problems is that people will automatically accept the universal. They will say, okay, all religions come from the same source, yada, yada, I can do whatever I want. The paradox is, and this is some of my work that I've been doing behind the scenes, is that actually what I'm going to say is it's best that you don't believe in the perennial philosophy. It's actually best that you act as if it was separated. And so I think what is sort of paradoxical about the multiplicity and unity is that to a certain degree, in the immediate understanding, it is best that we understand them as separately, but that we have to sort of work through the multiplicity and the unity. But it's also good that we understand that in the grand scheme of things, that multiplicity and unity are not opposed, but it is for our own benefit to sort of learn ourselves and our limitations, that I have to begin at separation. And that's why I think it begins at a divided self. I have to reconcile, do the work, so to speak, of this reconciliation, be the reconciliation between the unity and the many. So that's why I wanted to add that it is best to assume that it is separated at the beginning, at the immediate. But in the end, we all know theoretically from what is being said that the unity and the multiplicity are not opposed. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Uh, Also, I think the way I look at multiplicity unity is also through contradictions. Something from Hegel and Freud, to be something which we have already talked about also, to be able to hold the contradictory desires, to be able to hold contradictory selves and all of these things inside us. And I guess there is this in inner and external vis-a-vis relationship as well. For instance, in my life, I have always had friends who are quite like my types, but from past few years, I'm like little more experimenting, and now I have like little friends who are like, I have like more rainbow. And why I'm saying that, I've come from education and we celebrate multiculturalism and we theoretically talk about it so much without really knowing what it means. So I have this friend who is like visually disabled, and it's interesting to have somebody who can't see being part of your life, and the kind of things, the way the world opens up for you, the multiplicity and the contradictions which are out there in front of you, and how they become how there is this vis-a-vis relation that exists. So there has to be like this external also, and as well as the inner as well, which again I would say it's a pretty tough thing, but yes. Just on the other thing, Chetan, that I was talking about, and since you're a dear friend, and even if it's recorded, I would take the liberty of saying that it was very diplomatic of you to say, can you do something without thinking? I will not agree with you, and I'll catch up with you in evening on this. But knowing you personally also, I know that you are able to do a lot of these things through thinking, like to be and to think. I know that you are able to like work around it, but still I will not agree with your statement over here. Yeah.
So I'm put on the spot. So I try and respond to you and Thomas actually without taking some grand position philosophically. These are my sort of minds in philosophy where you have to take positions on one side or the other. You become stoic, or you become a speculative thinker or whatever. See, what I'm arguing against is not that I'm saying, oh, you need philosophical thinking to do things. That's not the point. So even when what Thomas was saying, you need to be aware of your own failures to actually navigate practice. When you think you're picking out, that is all, as Javier said, and I'm going near to Javier, that is all a form of knowledge that demands orienting yourself towards something such that you can encounter failure and say, this works and that doesn't work. That's no small feat. And if you can't do it, then how do you do it? And that becomes a challenge. If you can actually do it, great. I can do it, and you will fail somewhere else. And then that is where you would need to again go back to say, okay, fine, how do I, find that point again? What I'm trying to get at is that I am not arguing against theory or practice. I'm not even taking them as simple oppositions, to be honest to you. I don't think, oh, theory is this other thing than practice. Unless we really affirm the practice of theory and and theory of practice, we won't go forward in that discussion anyway. What I'm arguing against is this automaticity, very particularly that there is some form of practice that can automatically give us what we're getting in theory. I am merely making this small point. that somewhere we may seek refuge in some repetition. It may be theory or practice. We may seek refuge sometimes in philosophy also. There can be philosophers who might say, "Oh, I understood intellectually, I don't need to do it." And that theory becomes inert for them. That is also a refuge in some kind of repetition. And you may find a refuge in some kind of practice also. Oh, I meditate every day in the morning. Now I know God. I don't need to read anything in life. I don't need to think anything in life. And that also becomes the same kind of, and they both have their own similar paradoxes and pitfalls in some sense. So my concern here is not theory or practice as such. My concern is again this antagonism that we are trying to cause between them, this rift between that we are trying to cause between them. You may read what inspires you to move forward in your own practice, and you may do things that inspire you to read something. I remember a person in an audience asking a Sufi thinker, asking something, telling Sufi thinker and agreeing with him. Oh, books are bad. Rumi has written this. Books are like, in Rumi there's this metaphor of a donkey carrying the books, and and they're useless for him. When Sham actually meets Rumi, he actually throws all his books in the water. And, that kind of metaphor in that sense, that unless you experience life, there's no point reading it. And this actually writes in one of his books. It's very interesting that the person is getting up and saying it to a writer who's written almost 50 books in his lifetime. so so the challenge actually is again not this simplistic binary that there can be either, then if you read Hannah Arendt's version of thinking, what she's trying to actually do in her work is that she's trying to place thinking alongside action itself. She's trying to avoid this binary of thinking and action that emerges in Marx. That thinking itself is a form of first action in that sense, and you have to affirm it on that. So you can find, my only problem there is to not think through these oppositions merely in terms of automatic answers. That if I can't do theory, okay, let's try and find answer in practice. Let's find answer if I keep on doing something again and again. If I pray to God every day, everything is all right. Now that I think we need to encounter a failure on both the sides, whether theory or practice, and recalibrate ourselves and move forward and so on and so forth. And that would always involve us to go to the other side also. So if you're doing too much theory, the failure would be to be taken back to the practice. And if you're doing too much practice, the failure would ask us to go back to theory. And that movement will keep on shaping us.
Yeah, I think actually that was a really great point about the idea of awareness of failure, which is interesting because it's a negative term. It's a lacking. It's kind of awareness of a lack, which orients and directs. So you might not know the outcome, but you know what the failure is, and there's some limitations to that. But the basic argument here, I think that's pretty sound. I would say. So I understand what you meant by that. So yeah, I generally agree with that because the answer is failure in what? Like, where is that coming from? That has to be answered somehow. So I think that's a very fair point. Another thing, by the way, on this manyness versus oneness question, I get to talk about it last cycle. There's the line: oneness is not sameness. They're not the. You can have a diversity in one. It's perfectly possible. Also, another term also related is prosen, right? Basically, out of basically a relation and in relation to a one. So the idea of this is usually in terms of analogy, right? So basically, the word healthy related to medicine versus a body versus food being healthy, for example. They're all healthy by relation to the concept, but in different modes, in different ways. So there might be also another way of talking about there is a one being identified but expressed through different modes. Historically, traditionally, most people don't like that discussion because they usually just think that's equivocation, using the word unreasonably by making it the different meaning is too diverse from those terms. But in classical thought, in classic Aristotelian thought, for example, in Platonic, prosen was very reasonable, and that might be a way of articulating what this text is also trying to get at with the one and the many. and understanding how they relate, not in contradictions with each other, but in a unity together. That's all I got for this round.
I think this talk about theory and practice, it actually reminded me when I was kind of exploring through religious practices, and I was actually going to become Buddhist. I was like very certain I was become Buddhist. I was meditating every day, Chitan, and it was funny because I wasn't really like gaining any knowledge. I wanted to achieve enlightenment. I was so obsessed with it. I was like, I'm just going to meditate. The funny thing is, I was actually very happy. But the thing that was puzzling was I didn't know why I was happy. I had no thinking had gone into why I was feeling as good I was feeling and what I was necessarily experiencing. And so it's funny because it was that turn that I found, I decided to, entertain Islam and see what it has to offer. Because for Buddhism, for me, everything fit too perfectly. And yet I was like, I don't understand, like something is missing. And what's funny is that Islam itself ends up being a religion that emphasizes knowledge, right? To know, and it's a religion very adamant about knowing. And so it actually gave me this balance. Like I would say Buddhism gave me this balance of like, practice, meditation, but then Islam gave me this admiration for knowledge. And so, now I kind of laugh at myself thinking like, I was so happy as a Buddhist, but I didn't know anything, like just nothing at all. I was just walking around like blindly, just happy for just, I don't know why, and I can tell when I'm reading too much philosophy because it starts compounding into my soul, and it just, I start getting irritated and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh man, I wish I had that practice when I was a Buddhist again, because man, it was good. It was good. I could meditate for like 30 minutes, an hour. Like I was so into it. And now I'm like trying to establish myself, back into like prayer. But it's, I really understand the whole idea of the dialectic between theory and practice, where if you go one way or the other way, I mean, at least for me, it was very apparent that I could not do just one. It was very apparent. But other than that, I don't have too much to say. Besides that, every time Chitan brings up Hannah Arendt, I really want to start reading her now. So yeah, if you ever start a reading group for Hannah Arendt, Chitan, then I'm definitely down.
Let's start it. Let's
Let's
start
do.
it.
Let's do.
Let's do this.
I've been waiting to read Human Condition for a long time. So, I've been asking Jyoti
Yep.
also. If any of you are interested, I'm in.
Okay, yeah.
One
I
of the
mean,
things that
is
we
it
want to
Human
do.
Conditions, you said?
Yeah, that's the book.
Okay,
And it's a wonderful work in some sense.
okay. Well,
But Javier, what you were just saying about Buddhism and all, I think this is something that you or Thomas were just talking about some time back also. That this path of knowledge, and even when Nuha was summoning, this path is not for everybody as well. This path of knowledge, this path of thinking, and all of those things. So, I can intellectualize theory practice, and I understand from where Chetan is also coming, where practice should also inform thinking. However, these practices and the fact that you were happy, I mean, you have enough capacity, aptitude to go through the tough path as well now. But yes, I mean, it provides solace to like a large population, which also I feel has a value. Does it then resonate with what we were just talking about, where when we were saying that it's not for, maybe it's not possible for everybody to walk also on this to go through these forms of understanding, to go through this path of knowledge. It is a tough path. I don't know, how do we look at unconscious over here? I mean, when you were talking about it, because only yesterday in the Freud reading group Chetan was talking about, and if you were saying that you were unhappy, I don't know, through meditation and all, were you I mean, it's like hypnosis, where you were able to, one can reach the unconscious unconscious without through short circuiting the consciousness, or I mean, I don't know. I'm just thinking about it. How do we understand something like that? Because there is a role of unconscious also in this entire story that we are trying to unfold. Can we reach to our unconscious? Can we ever? Yeah.
Anybody can answer if they want to, by the way.
Topics for another book club, I suppose. I don't have an answer for that right now.
Well, I would add, Jyoti, the unconscious is something that I've been thinking about on the side because I've been reading William James, Varieties of Religious Experience. And it's a phenomenal, I mean, phenomenal piece of work. Some of the things that are kind of perplexing that William James arises is his case study on conversion, on on sudden conversions, and this was something that I was kind of critiquing about Freud, and maybe you guys can correct me, because I know generally Freud is very careful about what he says, and he's also very honest about the limitations of what he knows, and that's what psychoanalysis is. So I could be wrong in this critique, but it seems like, in my opinion, when we talk about the unconscious, Freud seems to take the sublimation aspect as something that you can gradually work up to getting, right? But what William James proposes is that there is this idea with the unconscious that actually someone can actually achieve simultaneous sublimation. And this is a part that is actually very perplexing, because what it happens is that there are certain people that are predisposed to unconscious suggestions. And because of these unconscious suggestions, it builds up over time. And all of a sudden it's an empirically sudden conversion. This person all of a sudden wants to, be a Christian. He wants to dedicate his whole life to God after being an atheist for however long, and being living a life of melancholy. All of a sudden he's so changed and he has a complete turnaround. It's a fascinating thing, and it's something that I feel like personally Freud didn't address, where you are just talking about this sort of slow and gradual uncovering of the unconscious, where we eventually sort of meet it, where we can finally put it in the consciousness and sublimate ourselves and transform these desires. I feel like that's where Freud went, but I feel like he didn't answer this process of sudden change. I think Jung kind of noticed this when he couldn't heal specific patients. He said that he would let nature would sometimes just take care of it. It would restore the equilibrium. So the question that you're proposing, Jyoti, is that, from my understanding and my reading of William James and Ibn Arabi, is that I think it depends. It depends on the predisposition. It could be the fact that actually with our unconscious, the person is required to slowly, gradually uncover the unconscious, and then maybe reach that sublimation. But the question of to what degree is again dependent on the predisposition. But there's also the other more perplexing side, where somebody doesn't do that work. They are basically blessed by the grace of God, by their unconscious suggestion and their predisposition by that they suddenly convert. I mean, it's a fascinating subject to me, and something that I'm still trying to think through. So yeah, maybe that helps. I don't know.
I think where we are at, I would like to sort of say a couple of points here. I think, if anything, meditation actually is normally viewed through this contradiction, where meditation itself becomes a short circuit to thinking that you've done some work to, it's pseudo work in some senses. Oh, I've done some work. I go sit quietly and stuff for 10 minutes, and I can reach God. And on the other side, meditation also stands for this idea that you can be completely conscious to the surroundings without judging them, without you know. And of course, we know if you enter into any spiritual practice, you can go to any monastery or any of these places. There they will first tell you that focus on your breath or focus upon something through which you can become conscious to your own self and so on and so forth. You can stand in judgment to yourself. Again, I think the question of the problem in that sense is not meditation as such, and these practices can be made out to be how you practice them, what skills you gain in them, how you learn them, and so on and so forth. I think the challenge, I think the Jyoti is trying to throw at us, and which I think we need to think about is that can there be a guarantee in these practices to escape your own pain? Because that is what we are seeking. As long as they are helping certain people to get something, that's great. But can we seek a certain guarantee in them? And a lot of times we start seeking that guarantee in practices where that guarantee doesn't exist. Eventually, whatever you are doing, you need to go and learn it, do it, practice it, and see what comes out of it and move further from there. There isn't. I can know a lot of people who did meditation and didn't help them at all, and I can tell you a lot of people who, tried reading philosophy and didn't help them at all, and for both for the same reasons that guarantee doesn't exist. You need to find your own movement forward from in that sense. And I think I've used this line before in this way that you can live in the world but not be of the world. Then that difference, that what does it mean to be of the world, that you've completely collapsed yourself into the world in that sense. And what does it mean to actually go and live in the world? And that is, it is only in the world that you gain certain practices, gain certain knowledges, gain certain ways of doing things, and so on and so forth. So how do we think through that problem that you cannot find certain guarantee in any practice, whether it's theory, whether it's philosophy as a practice, or it's meditation as a practice, or some religious practice, or even trying to cut a stone or do plumbing or whatever. You know that there cannot be any guarantee for a certain healing to take place, and yet it's only with taking that risk in any form of practice that something new emerges from there. And you can be honest to any of those practices. You can do philosophy, you can do meditation, whatever you think works for you at that moment. But the movement forward happens through that risk in some senses. Risk of learning something which you did not know before and seeing what comes out of it.
I think what's important to add to what John is saying is, and I love it because I totally agree with it, and it has to do with every spiritual teaching ever taught, is that, and I'll kind of put it in a simpler way, is that if you make the practice the end in itself, you're not going to get anywhere. If you make anything the end in itself, you're not going to get anywhere. The whole point of spiritual practices is that they are a means towards something. But the problem is people think that when they're meditating, they're like, yes, I'm going to reach enlightenment. Like I had caught myself before. Like, yes, I'm going to reach enlightenment. I'm going to keep meditating. It wasn't until one day I read this Buddhist book, and it said that, and it broke my heart. It really did. It said, if you are trying to achieve enlightenment, you will never get enlightenment. And I was like, oh my God, I'm done. I'm done with this practices. I don't know what to do anymore. What do I do? How do I get there? So in what it is trying to express is that Chaitanya is calling for this ultimate self-surrender, that you do things, but at the end of the day, all that it is trying to teach you is that this ultimate self-surrendering. And I want to also add another paradox on here. It's a Buddhist one, where even if you're saying that, okay, I must let go, it's okay. Let go of the fact that you cannot let go. Let go of the fact that you cannot let go. And, and see, that's what's funny about all the paradoxes of like Buddhism that I always enjoy, because it really teaches you all the contradictions that you run into when you with your desires. Basically, your desires make you run into so many contradictions that it's hard for me to just explain to normal people about what is happening. I love the saying, once you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. That is a real good thing to keep in my mind every single time, because once I start getting attached to something, I have lost all credibility. I don't know anymore at that point. I'm declining once I attach myself to something. So I guess in the end, it's how do we cultivate this non-attachment to the problems of multiplicity and unity? How do we cultivate this self-surrendering mode of being when we confront issues of multiplicity and unity? And that's that's the best way I could put it. I think Chetan phrased it perfectly too. So.
Yeah. Chetan, you want to say something?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, go ahead. I think Thomas was also, yeah.
No, I'm pretty solid. I think this is a good way to close out this chapter. Good stuff. Was it 8 pages? Nice solid 2-hour conversation. I think it's good. I think we can call it a day.
Yeah, I think this is the last round. So, maybe this was very interesting, and I was again thinking of this desire that we were talking earlier. That how there is something in the desire when we take response. What you are also talking about through self-surrender and non-attachment is taking responsibility of the desire, where you have the desire, but you don't let the desire hollow you out. There's a very interesting story that I just read of Chekhov, the lottery ticket, and what is it that the desire to win a lottery, how it could really ruin the relationship between husband and wife. Beautiful story that Chekhov has talked about. So what is it that a desire can do to us? That's what I was hearing when you were saying. Well, I think this was brilliant. It's always early morning, and I literally crawl out of my bed for this, and I wonder whether I should attend or not. But what is interesting is that you come to the session with certain reading of the chapter, but you leave it with a completely different paradigmatic shift. I don't know how does that happen. So thank you.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's right. I always do too. I always come out with a completely different understanding, different, reading of this. So yeah, thank you guys for attending, and thank you guys for watching. And that's going to be it for this episode.